Step 9 is all about quilting, and so before we even start that, we've got to find a backing fabric and baste our quilts. You'll notice on my first version of this quilt that I made, I used this kind of old-timey from the 90s floral fabric. And my thought, which I used for this one and I'm going to use for my new quilt, is to find a fabric that I have a whole lot of that I don't especially love, and I'm going to use that as my backing. So here we go, off into the storage area for fabric. It's a dangerous place. Oh, this is embarrassing, but I'm trying to keep it real during these Corona days. So this is my second bedroom, also known as the place where I store things. And the main amount of fabric that I have is here in this nice IKEA shelf, and I store it based on where I got the fabric. So not unlike the autobiographical, way of thinking that we talked about previously in the movie High Fidelity. So a short tour. These fabrics are the heavier density fabrics, so they're not necessarily in order. Then we've got hand-dyed fabric on the top, fabric that I bought in New York on the bottom. Then we have fabric from my trip to Seoul in South Korea. Then we have fabric that was given to me on the top by friends and acquaintances, on the bottom, things given to me by my mother. Then we have some kind of abundant stuff that I got from quilt guilds and things like that. Over here we've got fabric that I got on a trip to Mexico, and below it is fabric that I got at the discount textile outlet in Chicago. Then we have fabric from my former next door neighbor Jean, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are the things that I really like from her. And then we have fabric that's more contemporary, like from Joann Fabrics. I got a nice cotton and steel multi-pack from my brother back in 2015, and that's in there as well. And then we have fabric from the rummage that happens annually at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art. There's some more antique type fabrics. As we go even deeper in these realms, it's harder to say where they're from. I think this is stuff from when I was a teacher, although this one is from Mexico and belongs up here. Oh, so here's some stretchy type fabrics. Look, here's my backing fabric. See, it's from Jean. And so that's the main fabric tour. I could choose something from here, but, oh, and then up here I have there's lots of fabric. There's no lack of it, hence the desire to use what we have. Here are some books. These storage bins are more fabrics from my grandma especially, but not necessarily cotton, so it's harder to use for quilting. And then this is some fabric from my friend Sarah at 1000. She pulled some of that for me. And then I've got my bolts of things like the cotton muslin that I sometimes use from Joann Fabrics that comes in the 90-inch and the 100-inch. This is also where I'm going to find my batting, and I am a fan of this warm and natural, but I'm going to try to find some batting that is already cut up smaller so that I'm not using a great big package of it. So maybe this little, actually this is probably a really good piece. I might use this batting. But if we go through this door, in this medicine closet pantry area, in these bags are the dark recesses of fabric that I rarely want to use. And this is what I'm going to try to hunt through to find a fabric for this quilt back. Well, I've just pulled out one bag's worth of fabric and discovered these two beauties that are going to go in a different area because they're so pretty suddenly to me. And these are going to be real good for something at some point. I like these red things. Certainly a fun choice could be doing more florals. And these give me so many nostalgic feelings. That's the upholstery my mom used for our Heidi bed back in the day and for some curtains. So that's a family fabric. But I am somehow, even this really does not go with my quilt top, but I'm really drawn to these chili peppers. I think that these are from my mother. And I've just I was thinking this morning about how I really wanted more spice in my life. I'm kind of missing some of the usual passion because we're home alone. And I think that this is going to be another way to add to what I'm trying to manifest by using these passionate, spicy, exciting chili peppers as my background. I'm going to go for it. And I've got my warm and natural batting. I have about 8 feet of these chili peppers, so I feel good about using it. And I can see that it will cover from bottom to top my quilt. And so I want to make sure that I'm cutting it just a little bit wide of my quilt top. So here I'm going to square my corner. And now have that even, and I'm going to add about 4 inches, maybe 5 or 6, enough that I have an abundance on the edge so that things can move around a little bit. I'm going to cut this with a scissors and rip. And now I'm going to iron the back of my quilt. This is my beautiful quilt rack that I made with my dad, and after ironing I realized that my batting was one long skinny strip, so I cut it in half and zigzagged it together. And now to baste, I'm smoothing everything out. There's a lot of petting involved. I wanted to square things up, so I just nudged it over and used my ruler, and now I'm inserting safety pins. I love basting, and it's such a fast and easy thing to do. And now here we come to actually reading step 9, focus. When quilting, make a special effect in the emptiest area of the quilt. This could mean changing directions, quilting more densely, changing colors, leaving exposed knots, tie quilting, or overlapping lines of quilting. If we look at Anne Doval, she on Instagram is the Fit Quilter. This is the version that she made for the magazine as a sample. And her area of focus are these ties in her quilt. So you can see this beautiful spot where it's like the wind is blowing. She's also quilted in a variety of directions. There's a lot of movement. It's some beautiful hand quilting. Notice that it doesn't say you have to hand quilt your quilt. You can do any type of quilting that you want, but add one area that stands out as unique compared to the rest of the quilt. And so that was her solution here. In my quilt that I made previously, because of what I was looking to, oh, it's really good in the light right there too. So because of what I was looking to manifest with my hands holding over here, I wanted my quilt to start from the heart, to be heart-centered. So I began here in this heart area, and my quilting was done with a green thread. And you can see it's quite close together, about a 1/2 inch gap between lines of quilting. This is also, because of the color that I wanted, it's a thinner thread than what I would typically use. Oops. That's from where I added my sleeve. I didn't notice that till just now. Anyhow, when I leave my body, that is the moment where I leave that area of focus and I shift to red. And I shift to an inch gap for my quilting, and it continues to just radiate out in this circular pattern from the heart across the quilt. I used some philosophy from my training in yoga, because I'm also a yoga teacher, to choose the colors. And so in yoga, the heart chakra, the color for it is green. The colors go like the rainbow, so the root chakra is red, sacral is orange, stomach is yellow, heart is green, throat is blue, third eye is purple, and then the crown, the space above your head, is clear. But in the Western culture that I live in, red is the color for the heart. So I transferred from that internal heart color to an external heart color, and that's how I chose my thread. And I really love the way that this red stands out against my gold background. You can also see that I chose to leave my knots exposed. That certainly is the easiest option. And when I personally work on a quilt, and of course there are no rules on how you quilt, you can use whatever style you like, but I like to leave the knots on the top at the edge so that it's easy to square off, and then the knots get covered by the binding when we ultimately get to that. I don't know how thoroughly I showed this before either, but I love that this is some fabric that was given to me in a mended state. So it has some really beautiful mending work on it that I did not do. And so that's the quilting. As I start to think about how I want to quilt this current quilt, I want to consider where that area of focus is. It could be either, the emptiest part of the quilt, or it could be a meaningful part of the quilt. For example, starting from a body part that has a lot going on, or from one of the other areas of the quilt. Like maybe your first fabric would be a beautiful place to start quilting and radiate out from. You can also do straight line quilting for the whole quilt and then go back later and quilt on top again to add more emphasis. So the focus part could be where you start, or it could be where you end. It could be something that you do later. So let's get this set up and show you where I quilt. This is a cute little distraction for us. This is the first quilt that I ever made, ever pieced. The back or other side of it was hand pieced by someone else. My grandmother bought it at an estate sale. She stored it for years. My mother found it. She gave it to me. She said, "Heidi, I think you'd like quilting this." And guess what? I did. Back in, let's just show you my label. Back in 2013 is when I made this. So when I began quilting it, I liked the idea of the log cabin and it being the heart and hearth of the home. And so this is where I started quilting. It's the first part that I did. And you can see there are some areas that have bigger gaps that maybe aren't quilted as densely, but it allowed me to create this flaming heart design in the middle. And so I just quilted back and forth around, made this heart, did the flames. And so that could be a fun approach for you if you're doing some kind of quilting on a solid area and you're adding interest or a focal point. I also down here did this little sprout. So you can see this is where the dirt is. Here's my seed, the roots, and then the leaves coming up. And that was all quilted. So it goes through both layers of the quilt. So it's just a really fun option that if you had something you wanted to embroider but didn't want to take that much time to do that aspect, there's some really special ways that you can add detail and excitement in your quilting itself. This is also my most recently finished quilt, and you can see that I played a lot with the density of the quilting, and I used a variety of thread colors. I made the knots on here pretty exciting. And this is also the quilt that I used as an example of pleating to show all of you recently. But this would be a great way to go back in and add focus to what you're doing. So here you can see, I actually added this black much later. I initially had this part with just white thread. So you could go back in at the very, very end and add some additional quilting to make your piece exciting. Here's another favorite quilt of mine. This has some quilting that adds a lot of interest visually to the quilt. This is a line that I added at the very, very end. You can see how it crosses and overlaps the other areas. But even something like making a bright red U shape is able to add a lot of interest, a dynamic quality to the quilt. So long as you have one area of quilting that's different from the other areas, you're good. You can see this is a special technique that I layered things, so like this could still be nudged around even. And it is stretched on a frame, which is another way of finishing a quilt that I think is real fun. You can see that it is even hand pieced here at the edges. These are some tie quilt areas. See this where it's just a knot that goes through? So that is another way that you could add an area of exciting quilting. Welcome to my favorite place to quilt. Let me acquaint you with this area. I've got a painting I made of Paris years ago when I was more into painting. I've got a nice pillow that I made the pillow cover for lumbar support. I'm in a comfy chair that my mom had upholstered in the 80s that is still super attractive, and I like that it's wide enough that I can sit cross-legged. I also sometimes try to sit with my feet flat on the floor, as well as I have a chair opposite the table from me that I like to stretch my legs out on so that I can be in a variety of positions for my body. I've got a table, and this is a table from IKEA that was raw wood when I got it and assembled it, and then my mother stained it for me and we never varnished it, so it has some good traction. It's not a slippery surface. And then I've got my ironing board, and that is where I keep my computer so I can watch shows. And I've realized recently from a question one of my yoga students asked me in my weekly Monday and Tuesday evening yoga classes that I teach, she was saying that her neck gets sore when she's doing handwork and things, and how can she prevent that? And I thought, I bet my Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, HBO, etc. watching is really helping me, because when I used to be a ceramic artist, I was always making things and my neck would hurt a lot. And if I turned one way or the other, it would crack, and I had problems then, and I don't have any of those problems anymore since I left that job. And I think that the frequency that I lift my head up instead of staying hunched and down and focused when I want to watch my show really helps me. So I'm looking forward to filming myself quilting today so I can see how often I look up to look at the TV instead of just staying hunched the whole time. So I am a fan of watching things and learning and having fun while I'm quilting. I also have right here a heavy book. This book about women artists is one that my dad gave me years ago, and it is about 5 pounds, and I use it to keep tension when I'm quilting so that I'm able to hold things tight. It's kind of like I use it instead of an embroidery hoop. quilting hoop, and it is kind of like a third arm for me, or a third hand. And I'm about to show you my plan for how to quilt this quilt. Part of the theme of this quilt is that I'm doing the opposite of what I did on the other quilt. So last time I started with my area of focus, and this time I'm not doing that. I am, however, kind of enchanted by the idea of the hippity hop phrase that my mom used for me and still sometimes uses, which is so sweet of her. And I want to make a quilting pattern that looks like a hippity hop. So I've got 3 hops, 1, 2, 3, that I have charted out with this blue string. And it's the same way that I taught you to lay things out with our traveling step, where you lay down some string, and now I can go in and just hold that string in place a little bit more with some straight pins. So in this instance, I'm not going to remove the string, but I'm just going to go over holding it in place at the apex of the up and down. And it depends on how complicated you want your first line of quilting to be. Most of the time, 2 or 3 safety pins going across the quilt is plenty to chart it out, you know. Put in a straight line, put in a nice wavy curve, or you can just freehand it from the very start, and that is a really exciting improvisational way to allow that beginning of your quilt to happen. Certainly when I started with that teeny tiny circle at my heart space, I didn't have to chart anything for my first line of quilting. But if you want to chart something, now I've got my pins in here and they are showing my general up and down for that curve. And as I begin to quilt, I'm going to make sure that I am quilting off the edge of the table, and I'm using my heavy book. I'm going to be grabbing my quilt here, and very importantly, I am wearing some thimbles. So I've got a thimble for pushing. I like to push with my ring finger. Some people like to push with their middle finger. Both are fine. I'm also wearing a rubber gripper, and I could be using that rubber gripper either on my thumb to help pull or on my index to help pull. And so the more variety that you use in doing this, the better. But this is my favorite thimble situation. Something to help pull and something to push. I also, depending on the thread, and certainly if you can't find a thimble gripper that fits you well, you'd want to use this. These little discs are excellent for helping to pull the needle through. Somebody commented recently about just cutting up a rubber glove, the kind of glove that you would use to wash dishes with, cutting that into little squares. These are kind of expensive, and maybe I should just be using an old rubber glove instead. But anyways, having something with some grip to it is very, very helpful for getting your needle through. I am going to use a needle. I personally like using milliner's needles, and there are links to a majority of the tools that I like on my Amazon page, and there's a link to that on my Instagram and also on the purchase tab of my website. And I've decided that I want to use a majority of dark colors as I'm quilting so that they stand out, but then once in a while, so you really see the hop of the thing, once in a while I'll use one of these bright colors. So I'm going to begin with the very last little bit of this thread. I might measure it from my hand to my opposite shoulder, my whole wingspan, but using my body to measure my thread is very helpful. And I'm just going to thread my needle, same as we have been doing. And then I'm going to tie my quilter's knot the same way that we have been doing all along. And then, as I mentioned before, on this edge, I'm going to leave my knot exposed at the top edge of the quilt where it will be covered up by my binding. And I'm just going to begin quilting along this path that I've charted for myself. So I'll move that string a little bit and create a nice up down. I tend to rock the fabric more than the needle. You'll find your own comfortable way of quilting. And if you would like to know more about quilting, I did a whole hour-long webinar, plus there's about an hour worth of Q&A at the end of it, for the Modern Quilt Guild's webinars. And so for $30, if you are a member of the Modern Quilt Guild, you can log on and watch probably 200 free webinars they're included with the membership. And I've done 2 webinars with the MQG. One was on hand quilting, improvisational hand quilting, and the other was on improvisational piecing. And I broke down and explained 2 quilts that I made, and so I shared lots of details about those, and both of those webinars would be available to you, which is an incredible bargain if you ask me. And there are lots of other wonderful webinars on there from other great quilters, and of course this pattern was published in QuiltCon Magazine. That is done by the Modern Quilt Guild, and that is the same Modern Quilt Guild, the MQG, that has these webinars if you wanted to learn more about all of the details of hand quilting. But as you can see here, the thing I'm most passionate about, you want to take good care of your hands, is to have thimbles. You're pushing with those thimbles, pulling the needle through with the rubber gripper, and I do a lot of rocking with my left hand and holding things in place, tugging nice and tight, whether with a kind of mitten hand or my hand fully in place, wrapped around so you can see my thumb. And I am just going to continue quilting here, and I'm going to watch some TV or something else as well so that I look up more frequently and take good care of my neck. So I'll get you connected that way. You can see me here watching an episode of The Sopranos on my computer. In the next frame, which will be a close-up, I watch another episode of The Sopranos. And what you're seeing here is me quilting, staying in my chair, moving around a little bit. I tend to love to just sit and stay in the same place quilting for extended periods, although at a certain point the doorbell is going to ring and I'll get up. As you look in this space, you can see my thread to my left. You can see more thread and needles and notions to my right. And also to my left is my quilt rack. It's important to stay hydrated. That's one of the thermoses that I traced from my touch section. And even just watching this right now reminds me how much I love to quilt by hand. It's one of the most fun things that I can think of to do. I think it's also a very therapeutic thing for me, that when I'm in a moment that feels a little more difficult or challenging, that the best medicine is usually to hand quilt. It's amazing the things that I can think about in the background while hand quilting. It's also a really incredible way to train one's hands. And so I feel like when I'm quilting, my hands are expertly doing their thing, and my subconscious is making really great choices around the improvisational aspect of what I'm quilting. And it's amazing to be able to trust one's body to just do something while one's head is in another place, thinking about other things. Perhaps even thinking about Tony Soprano in this case. And if I've said it once, I'll say it 100 times. Please make sure that you are wearing a thimble. I don't have any big calluses on my hands. My hands never hurt me. They're never in pain. And that shouldn't be happening if you're quilting carefully and wearing the right protective gear. When I first began quilting, I did have a callus developing on my pinky from rubbing against my middle finger, wearing a metal thimble there. And also my thumb and my index would get kind of raw and swollen and tired, and I started to wear band-aids around my fingers to help protect them from squeezing the needle. And that's why in early 2015, when I was in South Korea, I got a thimble that was that rubber style of thimble to protect my fingers, and I've just never looked back. I love having that tool, and they've become more and more widely available here in America since that time. So protecting one's hands is so very important. I also use a paraffin wax dip to apply heat, so even if there are those subtler problems, they start before I feel them. If I feel a problem, that means it's really gotten bad. And so I try, especially on days when I'm quilting, to make sure that I dip my hands in that paraffin wax. Another great option is a sock full of rice that you can microwave for 2 minutes. Well, I am not going to finish quilting this tonight, but I did want to give you one last close-up view of the process. And so here you can see that I am pushing with my thimble. That's what I connect first. Then I like to put my other fingers here, although some people like to push with their middle finger. And then I rock mostly the fabric, partly the needle, and I'm moving that up and down so that ideally it's as though the needle is going into the fabric in a way that is perpendicular rather than diagonal. I've got my heavy book helping to create some tension. I personally like to stack quite a few stitches, then I push and pull through using that rubber gripper. And so it's just up, down, all the way across the entire quilt. You'll know what to do. And you're going to quilt everywhere. But because the name of this prompt is called Focus, in one area of the quilt, you are going to quilt it in a slightly different way, perhaps with a different kind of density, a different thread color, maybe even shifting between machine quilting and hand quilting. But whatever you do, you'll find a way to create some additional focus. And here again, you can see that I'm using 2 different sewing needles at the same time. I feel that helps me to be more efficient because I am not having to move my book as frequently. I also find that because I'm quilting improvisationally and I want to think about the unique things that are happening in each part of the quilt, when I'm using my needles in this way, got a take a knot out. There's something about being filmed that makes things a little less smooth than they would be otherwise. Anyhow, when I'm using more than one needle at a time, it allows me to think more about that particular area of the quilt and the way that I want the quilting to move across it. And that is very helpful improvisationally. So one last look, you can see up, down, going through, and I'm near the end, so I am going to tie my tailor's knot right here. I'm making my loop, sending the thread through, pulling tight and opposite, creating that situation that's similar to if you're helping someone with a gift wrap, and then pull. I like to do that twice. Sometimes for the second one, I'll actually pull my thread out, hold the knot, and then allow it to close right there. And I just do that if I've gotten to the bitter end of my thread and it's a little bit fiddly. So you can see right there, I've got my double knot from my tailor's knot that I use to finish things. So have a good week. Good luck quilting. If you don't finish quilting, that's all right. Next week, we are still going to move on to learning about binding a quilt. Bye and be safe. And at this point on Friday, this is where I'm at with the quilting. I have a scallop, like a single hop here at the bottom. And now in this area that has more negative space, it's more of a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh that I'm doing with darker colors. And so that may be all that I do for my area of focus, just quilting differently in this area. Or I may do something even more exciting. Only time will tell. But I hope that you enjoy quilting this week and adding an area of focus.